Hi, this is Mr. Lopez with our information about America as an imperialist power. We talked about the Gilded Age and the United States growing technologically. Now it's taking its desire for advancement to other parts of the world. When we remember the last unit, we know that the frontier was closed. We talked about Turner's frontier thesis. That meant that the country had reached its goal from sea to shining sea of settling all the way to the west coast. Of course, that meant that even though there was still land available, the official stance of the government was the frontier is closed, and people started looking elsewhere to expand. This idea that would come up next was imperialism. Imperialism was not unique to America. Other European countries were practicing imperialistic tendencies as well. This is when a stronger nation takes over a weaker nation. We have on the screen some reasons to do that, right? Why would we want to do this politically? We're competing with other countries around the world. We want to say that we have an empire just like they do. Economically, there's the desire for new resources, for new markets for goods. And then there's a social belief in American exceptionalism and this desire to spread that to other parts of the world. Of course, you can also look at that from the other vantage point that if America is saying we should spread our culture to other parts of the world, there's an implication that the people we are coming into contact with are somehow less desirable or less advanced than the United States. So, reasons money. We want money. We have this desire for military strength. We have a newfound technology, newfound weaponry. The Navy will become a key way that we make it around the world. And so there's this desire to flex that strength. Like we said, a desire for new markets, the frontier is closed, and these social desires. An important name to know during this time period is Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan focused on the importance of building up the American Navy. He knew that without a strong Navy, the US would not be able to compete. Think about it. This was way before airplanes, right? So, how do you get around the world? How do you flex your might? You need a strong Navy. And so, Mahan preached a necessity to build up the Navy, which does occur during this time period. There's a few places when we think about imperialism, and then there's maybe one we don't. So we're going back a little bit here, really to just after the Civil War. But if we're talking about expanding an empire, taking over new places, we have to start with Alaska. Even though this was just 2 years after the Civil War, William H. Seward, who had been Lincoln's Secretary of State and then as Johnson's Secretary of State, negotiates a deal with Russia to buy Alaska from them. It's called Seward's Folly. A folly is a mess up, a goof, something that you shouldn't have done. And a lot of people are making fun of Seward because of this. They're like, why would you spend all this money to buy an icebox, to buy icebergs, a frozen chunk of land? And of course, Seward had the last laugh as gold would soon be discovered in the Yukon and take people to Alaska. Just 50 years later, the desire for oil to fuel expansion, that's shown in Alaska. And of course, today, it's still a vital area for the United States as well. When we really look at the imperialist time frame of the late 1800s, Hawaii is one of the first places that comes to mind. We know it today as a state, but it of course, like every other state, was originally something beforehand. Hawaii was an independent kingdom led by Queen Liliuokalani. And for years, American businesses had been invited to Hawaii to do business there as mainly agriculture, pineapples, coffee. Today we think of maybe chocolate, macadamia nuts. All these things grow in a region of the United States where the climate is very different than the rest. As American businesses came in, though, there was tension as they accumulated land, wealth with the Queen. The Dole family, we think of Dole bananas today, right? Dole fruit. The Dole family was one of the largest landholders in Hawaii, and they're going to flex their muscle by basically starting a rebellion. They claim that the Queen is a dictator, that American business interests are being harmed, and that Native Hawaiians, Hawaiian citizens themselves, are being harmed. Dole and other planters partner with other Hawaiians who can say that they are harmed, and they basically start what they call a revolution. Now, this revolution, uh, of course, isn't really a revolution. There was no real danger, but this is an invented crisis to take over the kingdom. This will actually span a few different presidents. So we have Harrison, who was there at the outset. He sends in the U.S. Marines to protect American interests. They overthrow the Queen. The planters make themselves in charge, and they claim that they'll rule Hawaii in the interest of all people. Of course, you know that this isn't really the case. Queen Liliuokalani is forced to abdicate her throne. She's kind of imprisoned in her palace, and there's kind of this waiting game. What's going to happen with Hawaii? Will it stay a territory? Will the United States take it over? What will happen? Harrison's gone and Cleveland is there. Remember, for his term, we talked about him being unique in the last lecture. And Cleveland doesn't want any part of this. He can kind of see this for what it is just a land grab. And he really refuses to do anything about it. So Dole declares Hawaii an independent nation. It'll stay that way really throughout Cleveland's term. And it's not until 1898 when Congress declares it a territory. President McKinley approves of this annexation, and Hawaii becomes a territory of the United States. It'll stay a territory for another 60 or so years until it becomes a state. This is still a sore subject today. In 1993, the U.S. Congress officially apologized for the U.S. actions or the actions of American citizens in the overthrow of Hawaii. Today, Native Hawaiians still see this as kind of analogous to what happened to American Indians on the 48 contiguous states, where people were displaced from their land. It was taken away from them. And so we had the US officially apologizing, but really no other action in 1993. So the next big place where the US is going to turn its interest is to a country that's been on the decline for quite a while, and that's Spain. If you think about Spain in 1492, right, with Columbus, they were on top of the world. They had from North America down to South America, almost all of that land was Spanish land. Spain's empire slowly, though, started to erode. We think of the Mexican Revolution, other revolutions in Central and South America. And so Spain is really losing its territory. It's almost, I like to use the analogy, think of somebody who used to be a famous Hollywood A-list actor, actress. They were making millions and millions for a movie, but their career's kind of gone downhill. And now they're nothing against it, but now they're doing TV movies. Maybe they're making Hallmark movies. Hallmark movies are great, but I'm sure they would rather be making more money and, going on those red carpet premieres like they used to. That's kind of the status of Spain in the late 19th century. Or you can think of it another way. Maybe there's a basketball player that was in the NBA that did really well for a few years, but their game declined and now they're playing overseas. They're still making some money, they're still playing their game, but they're just kind of trying to hold on to what they have. That's Spain at this time period. So Spain has lots of territory still. Most of it, however, are islands. There's Cuba, there's the Philippines, there's Puerto Rico, there's Guam. Those are the big islands, and the U.S. is going to look kind of hungrily at those lands, particularly Cuba. And if you think about why Cuba, what's there? Well, remember, it's just south of Florida. It's very close to the United States. American businesses had already been there. And so they're doing things like growing sugar, tobacco, they're mining, and then they're also building railroads. There's a lot of business interests already happening in Cuba, even though it was a Spanish territory. So in walks at this time period a kind of a cool guy, Jose Marti. He's a man of many talents. He's a poet. He's a journalist. He's an activist. He's going to lead a revolution, and so he leads this revolution of Cubans against Spanish rule. You might have heard the phrase "Cuba Libre," free Cuba. Um, this is his doing. He had spent time in the United States, so he was inspired by American ideas. And as this happens, the U.S. is kind of split. What do they want to do? Do they want to take the Cuban side? Do they want to take the Spanish side? Do they just want to stay out of it? And so reaction is split, but eventually the U.S. will get involved. It'll get involved because of a apparent attack on an American naval ship, but that's also hastened by journalists. So, how can journalists start a conflict? Maybe today we hear the word fake media, or we know that there's different types of news outlets with different spins on them. That kind of is reflected during this time period with an idea called yellow journalism. So, with yellow journalism, authors are exaggerating headlines, and they're doing it to sell newspapers. This is a time when cities often had two major newspapers. You would pick up a newspaper in the morning, maybe on your way to work. And there would even be an evening edition. People would read the newspapers quite a bit. And you had two different choices in front of you. So, how will you know which one to buy? Well, if you're looking at them on the newsstand, you're probably going to go with the one that has the most interesting title, right? That's where yellow journalism comes into play. And these are two famous names that we still hear today. William Randolph Hearst. Hearst newspapers are still around. The Hearst Company still owns newspapers throughout the country. And then we have Joseph Pulitzer. If you're into literature, news, you've heard of the Pulitzer Prize, right? That's going to be made by and because of him. So what happens? The U.S. sent a ship called the Maine to Havana, and it's docked in the harbor there in 1898, really as just to kind of show that America has an interest in what's happening in Cuba. They want to protect American plantations, other interests from this destruction that's going on. And all of a sudden, the ship explodes one day. There's no clear cause at first, but you can imagine that people are going to say, well, the ship doesn't just blow up, right? Something had to have been. It must have been on purpose. And that's going to be the spin that these newspapers take. They'll exaggerate these headlines and they'll really whet the public's appetite for war. It could have been a mechanical failure. It could have been, it's kind of crazy, static electricity can build up. Where the ammunition was stored was not in the best place. And so it's very likely now we know that this was an accident. However, when people are already anxious, when they're scared, when they're worried, something like this can easily trigger a war. Take a look at this image here. We have two examples of newspapers. We talked about the competing publishers before. What examples do you see of yellow journalism in these? The first one, right? Spanish treachery. Doesn't sound like it could have been an accident. Doesn't sound like they know what happened. It sounds like it's pretty definitive that the Spanish blew up this ship. The second one, main explosion caused by bomb or torpedo. Again, it's not a question of was it intentional or not. They're saying it was intentional. What caused it? So these are just some examples of yellow journalism leading to people to the conclusion that this was indeed a purposeful act by Spain. Something else that contributes to this is the Delhomme letter. And this is one of the, maybe sometimes you accidentally send a text to the wrong person where you might say something negative about somebody else. This is kind of one of those situations. There was a Spanish minister to the United States. So he's sending a message back to Spain saying, hey, President McKinley, he's kind of a crowd pleaser. He just goes along with, whatever's happening, whichever way the wind blows. He's not that strong of a leader. He means to send that back to Spain. However, it's intercepted by Cuban rebels. And of course, Cuban rebels, they kind of want the U.S. to go to war against Spain, right? So they get a hold of this letter. They show it to the United States like, hey, look what Spain is saying about you behind your back. That, of course, will also contribute to a desire for war. Here we have another image of William McKinley waiting for the facts. Behind him, it says, be sure you're right, then go ahead. He's looking out at the committee, the investigation committee, as to what happened to the Maine, but we do know that the U.S. will go to war. So 1898 is one of those important years to know in American history. That is the year, the start and the finish of the Spanish-American War. This war will be fought in two different areas. One is in the Philippines, far out in the Pacific, close to China, and the other will be in the Caribbean. In the Philippines, the Filipinos themselves were already rebelling against Spain, and they were led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who is a Filipino national hero, and they're fighting against Spain. So, of course, they welcome the U.S. being involved in a war against Spain because they see the U.S. as an ally to help them defeat Spain. America sends its navy, led by George Dewey, and the Spanish Armada is defeated in one day. Remember, we said Spain was just barely hanging on. That's kind of where they're at. It's really not much of a fight. Second part is in the Caribbean. Actually, let's go back real quick. So what's going to happen in the Philippines is that once America is free, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the Filipinos are like, yay, we won. We can be free and independent. And the U.S. is going to say, not so much. The second area of fighting is in the Caribbean, centered around Cuba, which was Spain's big possession. And again, the U.S. has a fairly easy time routing the Spanish militarily. In fact, this entire war, more Americans will die from disease and contaminated food than they will in fighting, which is kind of crazy to think about. Mosquito-borne diseases are a huge issue. There'll be a huge issue in Cuba, in Panama as well, when we talk about the canal a little bit later. And the idea of canned meat was a fairly recent invention. And unfortunately, if you don't can meat properly, or you still have to store it properly, then that itself can lead to disease. So just kind of an interesting fact about deaths during this war. One of the most famous people who becomes famous out of this is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was sitting behind a desk when the war started, and he wanted to get involved. And so he basically recruits a gang of enlistees to help him out. They're called the Rough Riders, and they will have a victory at their most famous victory is a place called San Juan Hill. They triumphantly run uphill to attack and defeat the Spanish. And that's what we see in this image here. If you visit San Antonio, Texas, you're probably going to go to the Alamo. That's my hometown. So here's a little factoid. When you're there looking at the Alamo, if you're looking straight at it, if you look just to the right, you'll see a big hotel called the Menger Hotel. That hotel has been there for a long, long time. You can see from the satellite map, it's literally right next door. Teddy Roosevelt did a lot of the recruiting in the bar of the Menger Hotel. So you can see the historical plaque that's there. If you look behind the bar, there's a framed portrait of Teddy Roosevelt. So you can walk into this bar, which is not very big, and you can actually sit and see where Teddy Roosevelt did his recruiting to get volunteers for the Spanish-American War. I think that's pretty cool. So what happens? There's a Treaty of Paris. Paris was apparently the place to go to negotiate treaties. Remember, there was also a Treaty of Paris way earlier in American history, and then there was one before that too. So the Treaty of Paris of 1898 will be the one that ends the Spanish-American War, and this will do the following. So it will free Cuba of Spanish rule. Cuba is nominally independent. The U.S., however, is going to be looking over their shoulder the whole time, kind of annoyingly. Maybe like a helicopter parent who's asking, "Hey, did you do this? Did you do that?" Spain will cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. So they will just be taken by the United States. And the United States will agree to buy the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. Again, Spain lost, so they really couldn't dictate the terms, but perhaps the US is going to buy the Philippines to maybe assuage some guilt about what will happen. And so, because of these things, because of the Spanish American War, the US really is an imperial power in the world. They're on the world stage. They have not huge chunks of continental land, they don't have land in Asia, Africa, or South America like other European countries, but they do have islands. Here's an interesting take on things. So, this is William McKinley talking about what to do once the war is over. He says he realized that the Philippines had dropped into our laps and I didn't know what to do with them. So let's see what his four options were. Give them back to Spain. Well, he's not going to do that. He says it's cowardly and dishonorable. We just defeated them in a war. Why would we give them this land? Two, we could give the Philippines to another country like France or Germany. Well, they're our rivals, so why would we want to help them out by giving them land? He says three, we could leave the Filipinos to themselves. We could let them be independent, be their own country. And this is going to be really an attitude throughout most of the imperialist time period. He says they're unfit for self government, that they would soon have anarchy and misrule, worse than how it was had Spain still been in charge. Finally, he says four, really the only choice, the only logical choice, according to McKinley, is to take them, to educate them, to Christianize them, and do the very best we could for them. This really seems to kind of be in line with American thinking, right? With American Indians from the late 1700s throughout the 1800s. This is a similar argument made against Hawaii. We'll see similar things said about Puerto Rico, American Samoa, other places as well. There really is this idea that the US was superior and the subjugated people were inferior. This cartoon's a little old, a little pixelated, but it says 10,000 miles from tip to tip. And so as we look at it, right, we see the eagle spreading its wings. We see Manila, the Philippines, to the west, and we see Puerto Rico all the way to the east. When you think about, right, if you take somebody under your wing, you're protecting them, right? That's certainly the idea that this cartoon is putting forward. Here we have another cartoon. I love this one. This is a great one to analyze. McKinley is a waiter. Who's he serving? Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam says, I hardly know which to take next. And it says bill of fare. Now, it's not a bill like a check. This is the menu. And look at the menu items. I see Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, even the Sandwich Islands, right? Uncle Sam doesn't know which one to take. The implication is that the US has these and can take them at will, just like ordering something off of a menu. So this war was called by some a splendid little war. That, of course, ignores the fact that people on both sides fought, died, that land was taken. But the fact that this war just lasted mere months, that it started and ended in 1898, shows why it was often called a splendid little war. Now that the war is over, the U.S. is going to focus on some other parts of the world, including Panama. Panama, of course, we know today has the Panama Canal. Other nations had tried to build a canal across Panama before and given up. McKinley was assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt takes over. We see him in the picture. And this will become Teddy Roosevelt's real kind of passion project to build this canal, to finish a canal across Panama. Panama itself is an isthmus, right? It's not very, very wide. There is a lake in the middle of it. So, really, you're just digging this huge ditch throughout Panama. Maybe when you say it that way, it sounds simple, but the reality is very different, right? How do you move that much earth? There's also an elevation change. So locks will have to be built, which are kind of like elevators for boats that go through. They pull into kind of a segment. There's a gate in front of them and a gate behind them. If you're trying to go up, both of those gates close. They pump water in, the ship rises, and the gate in front of you opens, and now you proceed through until you get to the next time you need to move up. The gate behind you closes, water is pumped in, it rises. So it really is an engineering marvel that the U.S. is able to accomplish. We see Teddy Roosevelt there sitting in an earth mover trying to work on the Panama Canal. Another idea to think about, if you think back to the first half of U.S. history, was the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe told Europe, hey, you know what? Now that there's some independence in this half of the world, Europe, you stay on your half, but America, we're gonna stay on our half and don't come over, because if you do, we might try and fight you. They're somewhat empty words. They're a threat. We weren't necessarily able to back that up in the early 1800s, but we certainly are when Teddy Roosevelt comes to power. And he's going to issue the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Corollary, if something correlates, it goes along with something else. And so we can see in this text, Teddy Roosevelt is referencing the Monroe Doctrine. He's reminding Europe, hey, remember, we had this thing before. It's still there. And if necessary, the U.S. will act as an international police power. So we will enforce, through our own might, our way of life. A popular saying of Teddy Roosevelt came from an African proverb, which was speak softly, but carry a big stick. It's also known as big stick diplomacy. So there's this idea of using maybe threats of force, using your influence to get things done that you want. And he will apply this throughout the Western, or throughout North and South America. Other presidents will do so as well after him. Another point of interest for the United States during this time period is China. The United States had kind of been on the outside as other European nations had kind of monopolized trade with China, different parts of China. And so the US wants to get involved in this part of the world. After all, the Philippines were on the doorstep of China. That was one of the main reasons why the US wanted the Philippines. Secretary of State John Hay goes to other European nations and is kind of smart, and he plays them off of each other. He says to the British, hey, you have this business in this part of China, but look at Germany and France. They're involved too. Shouldn't we increase competition by letting places like the United States come in? He goes to France, says the same thing. Hey, y'all have this issue over here, but maybe we should open up competition to everybody. Says it to Germany as well. And so the United States is able to kind of get a foothold in business with China, which is, of course, going to be a market. It'll be a source of raw materials. And kind of going along with the ideas of the time, there's this kind of implication that if we need to use force to back this up, we will. Maybe a theme with all of this imperialism talk is the fact that the imperialist countries, the US, the other European nations, none of them are really asking the people that they're going to what they think of things. And that's really the case in China as well. China, in many ways, did not want all this outsider influence. And there will be a rebellion that begins, the Boxer Rebellion, which you might remember from world history, in which people fight against, in which Chinese fight against imperialist nations coming in. That rebellion will be put down, and the US and other countries will maintain their commercial interests in China. We kind of see that in this image, right, where the world's great powers are competing with each other, but who has suffered the most is China. And that could also be said maybe about other places. So, as we kind of conclude this look at imperialism, first let's see what the US gained during this time period. We started with Alaska. We see islands throughout the Caribbean, from Hawaii to the Philippines, Wake Island to Guam. These will be places that we may not hear much about again until World War II, when they're involved in the Pacific Theater. And then, of course, we see in the Caribbean, we see Puerto Rico, we see the US Virgin Islands. Cuba is not highlighted on here because, again, Cuba was nominally independent, but the US has really gone from, if you just think of the continental United States or the contiguous states, has enlarged itself quite a bit during this time period. A lot of Americans celebrated this, right? They're players on the world power, they have influence, they're making more money, but not everybody is an imperialist. A lot of people saw this as maybe a power grab and subjugating other people around the world. Mark Twain was one of them. So you have this quote from Twain. He says at the beginning that he was a red hot imperialist. And he thinks about the Philippines, right? Why shouldn't we take over and spread our goodness over there? But let's look at the last two paragraphs. He says, I've thought more since then. I've read carefully the Treaty of Paris and have seen that we do not intend to free them, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. So Twain really shows the dichotomy during this time period where the US is taking over land, but there certainly is debate. Does what happened reflect American values or not? That'll be a trend that will continue. I'd like to thank you all for watching. This is a production that I made. All rights are reserved. Take care.